Blessings everyone, this is Reverend Afrin with the Four Pillar Shrine. Today I'd like to do a video on the definitions of paganism. Now, a lot of people who are not new to paganism will realize that these words and these definitions seem very similar. Those of us who are new to paganism or just beginning on the path might find a lot of these words to be new. And, there might be some older people who have never heard of some of these words before either. I, on the other hand, have a bachelor's degree in religious studies. I've studied religion scholastically, classically. However, some of these words were also new to me up until a couple of years ago. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the definitions of paganism and talk a little bit about what some of this stuff means. So hopefully you enjoy it. Alright, so first I'd like to talk about the word theism. The word theism basically means, it's a Greek word, it basically means the belief in a god, the gods, multiple gods, whatever. And so from theism comes multiple other words. For instance, atheism, a being the prefix for negation, so atheism meaning non-religion or non-religious or non-belief in the god or gods. Then, of course, there's monotheism, mono meaning one, monotheism meaning the belief in one God, the belief in one supreme God. Now, it also stands that many of these monotheistic religions are also what some people have termed creedal, meaning that they follow a particular creed, a particular style, a particular scripture, a particular creed. So these religions, monotheistic religions, generally are creedal. Not that there aren't other religions that are also creedal, but generally speaking, most monotheistic religions are based in scripture of some sort. And then, of course, there's polytheism. Poly meaning more than one, multiple, plural. So polytheism is the belief in multiple gods. Now that can be further broken down, and it can get kind of complicated, and people think, well, it's belief in multiple gods, right? No, I mean it is, but are the gods an emanation of one god? In Wicca, we believe that all the gods and goddesses are emanation of a single divine source, or a single divine polarity or dichotomy. So does that complicate things? A little bit. I mean, it's still polytheism, but not, I suppose you would say, traditional polytheism. Now, when you think about traditional polytheism, you think about, for instance, Greek, Egyptian, Celtic, Norse pantheons. In these instances, at least historically, these peoples believed that their gods existed physically, in physical form, separate from one another. And often these deities existed in particular areas at particular times. So there is a slight difference between, I guess you could say, philosophical polytheism and more traditional polytheism. So, I mean, they're both polytheistic, but again, there is a variation there. And in modern reconstructions, frequently they stick with the traditional understanding of polytheism. Of course, then there's pantheism. Pantheism is the belief that the entire universe is made up of God. God is the universe is God. So everything that exists in the universe is sacred because everything that exists in the universe is God. So there's no separation, and the word they use is immanent, meaning that God is here, God is now, God is always here. Adding to that basic understanding of pantheism is another word, panentheism, which is a word that I recently discovered, which I find really interesting and very telling. Panentheism is similar to pantheism, that God is immanent, God exists in this world, God is creation. But Panentheism takes it a step further and says that, yes, God is of this world, God is part of this world, but God is also out of this world. God is both immanent and transcendent. So panentheists believe that God is the world, God made the world, but God is the world. So every rock and tree and creature and everything that we can see physically on this planet is God, but there is also a spiritual, invisible component to God which rules over the spiritual side of our lives. So that is probably a better definition of Wicca, because we believe that the gods are physical in nature, but they are also spiritual. So, now that we've understood a little bit about the theisms, let's talk a little bit more specifically about Wicca and paganism. So, of course, everyone knows the definition of pagan, and everybody knows the definition of Wicca, but I'm going to tell you again. Paganism, or pagan, is a word which means from the country or country dweller. These were people that lived in the country that were separate from their city counterparts. Now, originally, the word was meant to say, oh, it's a country person. It's somebody who lives in the country. Now, the connotation is that these people are less superior, less civilized than the people who live in the city. Now, when Christianity became popular in the Roman Empire, the people who lived in the city had the benefit of being able to practice Christianity because it came to the cities, and their main centers of worship were in the cities at first. So people who lived in the country really didn't experience Christianity, and even if they had, they really wouldn't care, because the people who lived in the country were Argarian. They practiced their rituals based upon the cycles of the year, based upon the cycles of harvesting, planting, harvesting, reaping, that sort of thing. So when Christianity first came in, people really weren't on board with it, because they're like, well, it doesn't really communicate with me. It doesn't really connect with my past, with my history, with my family, with my ancestors. It doesn't connect with my daily life, because my life is Argarian. My life is all about planting and seeding and sowing and etc. And so it doesn't really relate with me at this point. So people who lived in the city began to refer to people who lived in the country as pagan. Again, definition, people who live in the country. But the connotation was they were less sophisticated, they lived in the country, they didn't have all the things people in the city did, and of course, they didn't practice Christianity. So later on, as time went on, the word pagan became a derogatory term, and you find the use of the word pagan in Scripture very frequently, referring to people who were nefarious, people who had bad intentions, people who may have been aligned with the devil, people who may have, didn't believe in God, were heretics or heathens or infidels, or, any number of things that basically meant they did not align with the Christian mainstream. So, as far as I'm aware, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but back in 2010, the Parliament of World Religions tried to make a change of definition to the word pagan. Now, I don't know if this definition has taken off. I don't know if it's really that well known. Maybe I'm pulling it out of my ear. I don't know. But from what I gather, the Parliament of World Religions in 2010 had decided that they wanted to update the definition of the word pagan. And they wanted to make the word pagan a definition coming from pagans as opposed to coming from Christians representing or explaining pagans. So we were given the opportunity, delegations of pagans at the Parliament of World Religion were given the opportunity to define themselves. So what they decided, to the best of my knowledge, from what I remember about this time, was that they decided that pagan would be a word to describe indigenous ancestral religions of Northern Europe. So, of course, that would include Anglo-Saxon paganism, Norse paganism, Celtic paganism. That would also include, that's it. I'm sure I'm missing one. So, technically speaking, under that definition, some other forms of paganism that we would, under the old definition, consider paganism, like Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Shintoism, those wouldn't have been considered pagan under the new definition. So I don't know exactly what that means for us today, but whatever. So anyway, Wicca, of course, as we know, is a type of paganism. And I'm going to try and put up a little thing on the screen here so you can see my cute little pie chart that I made. So Wicca is a slice of the pie, which is paganism. Paganism is made up, depending on the old definition or the newer definition, of various indigenous religions. Religions that grew naturally over time and were native to certain areas. That's what indigenous means. So, indigenous religion of one particular area in Africa or another may be different, but they grew up naturally over time. They developed over time. They were organic, they were natural, and they met the needs of the tribal peoples that lived in the area. And in modern paganism, again, draws its roots from Northern Europe. And Northern Europe is so fascinating because a lot of their religions have intermingled or flowed together because people moved very easily because the climate was all the same in Northern Europe. Now, moving from north to south, the climate is going to be, different. That's why we see, for instance, Native Canadians, their culture, practice, religion, etc. was vastly different from Native Mexicans because they did not intermingle. They didn't travel. People who were living in that cold climate up north were not traveling down south, and vice versa. However, in Europe, you have people living in, modern-day Spain that are traveling east and west, going all across Europe, and they're exchanging ideas. So you find a lot of variation, but it's very similar variation. The ADF and other groups, ADF Druid groups and other groups, refer to these cultures as Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European. So they have, a lot of the same basic ideas. They have a lot of the same basic, structure. Anyway, so Wicca is a branch of that, and of course most people know that Wicca began in the 1900s, 1950s, depending on who you talk to, thereabout. And of course it was... It's a form of paganism, and it's more of a revival than it is a reconstruction. And people who practice Wicca can be considered to be pagans, but people who practice paganism are not Wiccans, always, because there's so many variations of pagan. So, while we're talking about Wicca and the beginning of Wicca, let's talk about revival versus reconstruction. So a revival is basically where you try to bring back something that is older, something that's been around, something that you know about, that you're taking and you're trying to just wake it up, wake up, wake up. You're reviving it, you're bringing it back. So the understanding is that it's going to be the same as it was before, it's just kind of dusting off the dust, and bring it back to life. Reviving it. So, Wicca is a revival, but in the same ways, it's not exactly in that way. Because whereas early Wiccans believed that Wicca was a practice, a faith that had history for thousands of years, we've now come to the understanding that's not entirely true. Does that make Wicca any less of a legitimate faith? No. Wicca is still legitimate. We just have to understand exactly where Wicca comes from. It's not as old as we want it to believe that it is. Now, some of the beliefs might be, some of the deities we worship might be, some of the understandings or worldview or mindset might be older, but generally speaking, what we know as modern Wicca is a conglomeration of multiple practices and rituals and things that have kind of been lumped together to make a very effective religious practice. Reconstructionism, on the other hand, is where people who have a scholastic motivation are able to go back, study, research, learn, and develop a religious practice that is strongly based upon evidence about the past. And the downside, in my opinion, to Reconstructionism is that people get so wrapped up in trying to reconstruct the past the way that they think it was, or what, science is coming up with new discoveries all the time. And one new discovery can blow everything out of the water in a lot of cases, especially when it comes to religion, especially when you're so focused on keeping something the way that you believe it was. But understanding that religion, especially paganism, is a living, breathing religion, we can't let ourselves get wrapped up into saying, okay, this is the golden age of paganism. This is the golden age of Egyptian or Norse or Celtic paganism, and we have to emulate this in our life. We have to realize that it's living and growing. Do you think that the Norse paganism that's practiced today was the same Norse paganism that was practiced during the Viking Age? Might be close because of people's reliance on scholastic information to get as close as they can. However, our mindset and our understanding is not going to be exactly the same as, Thorinir the Viking, because we didn't live during that time and we can't ever really emulate that mindset. We can emulate the practices as best as we know, but we can't emulate that mindset, how the person was feeling, how that person was living, because we don't live during that time. So I think that getting wrapped up in this idea of a golden age of a particular religious path is making people rigid, and it's causing a lot of the problems that we see in monotheistic religions, scriptural, creedal-based religions today, because they are so focused on keeping things the way that their book, their faith is forcing them to keep it. So a lot of these reconstruction groups are falling into that pit there, but I think a lot of them are starting to realize, hey, wait a minute, this is something, we're living, we're breathing, our beliefs are going to change. I recently read an article, which I'm going to try to include at the bottom here, if I'm allowed, I guess. I hope I can. About Norse paganism and modern Norse paganism, and this idea that I just mentioned about, living, breathing tradition and things of that nature. And one thing that I liked about it was the author of this article was talking about how people in the past, people during the, golden age of the Vikings or whatever, used to, beliefs would change. They would bring these ideas in, they would bring these stories in, and if the group decided that it made sense, it was a good story, it related to them, it made them feel connection to the gods, then they kept it. And things that later, weren't as important kind of fell out of style. And that's part of pagan practice, and it should be. And people are like, what? You're just making that up. But at the same time, it's important to allow that dynamic, organic growth. Anyway, let me get off my soapbox about that. So, we have Wicca, we have paganism. We also have a belief called animism. Animism is the belief that all things are animated or have inside of them a spirit. These things have an intrinsic spiritual essence. Trees, rocks, flowers, anything from the natural world has a spiritual essence. We also have a belief called omnism. Omnism is a belief that all religions deserve respect. All religions have some truth to them. And we should respect all religions because all religions have some truth, some essence of truth. So I suppose you could consider, depending on your particular tradition, you could consider Wicca to be a polytheistic, panentheistic, omnist, universalist religion. That's a lot, right? That's a lot. So now that we've kind of talked about the basic layout, let's talk a little bit about certain positions that specific groups might have. And I don't want to single out any group by mentioning a certain group with these definitions, but let's talk about the definitions. So one of the definitions is universalist. And this doesn't necessarily have to do with your belief about God. It has to do with your belief about who can believe in God. And so a universalist tradition is a tradition that allows anyone to practice that faith. You're a universalist. You believe that God is universal. In Wicca, I would say that the belief is that God is universal. There is a pitfall there as well. It opens the door up for so much diversity that it makes it difficult for individual Wiccans to find a path or a niche that is comfortable for them because of the amount of diversity. So a universalist tradition is a tradition that allows anyone to worship no matter who they are, what they are, where they are. Wiccans are all over the world. You can be a Wiccan and live in Thailand. You can be a Wiccan and live in Canada. You can be a Wiccan and live in some island, deserted island. And then you have these other words, and I'm not entirely sure of the nuances in them, but you also have folkish and tribalist. And the way that I understand it is that a folkish a folkish tradition is a tradition that focuses on a particular pantheon, a particular organization, a particular ethnic culture. Because of the folkish nature, the belief is that not everyone can practice that faith. Only people who live in a particular area of that ethnic group or have heritage of that ethnic group can they worship this particular tradition. As an example, I've been studying Shintoism, and there's very little information on Shintoism in the West because not a lot of information on Shintoism has been translated into English. Most of it's in Japanese. So you find a lot of obviously, you have to either know Japanese or be Japanese to really understand the essence of Shinto. And a lot of these books about Shinto are that are written in English are more informational than it is about practicing, because some of these authors believe that only Japanese people with Japanese heritage can practice Shinto. And I suppose in some ways I can understand that, because taking Shinto deities out of their environment and bringing them to a completely different foreign alien environment to worship them might be difficult for certain practitioners to relate. So I can understand that. However, there have been a lot of people who find that tribalist traditions are racist. because they don't allow certain people to be involved. And that is a shame. It's a challenge, but and I'm not agreeing or disagreeing in one way or another, but I can see how being exclusive in certain ways with certain things is maintaining integrity for certain religious practices. I see how universal Wicca has been so positive and has been open to a lot of different people, but at the same time, I see the pitfalls of universalism. So it's definitely something that you have to kind of come to terms with. Are you going to be a tribalist Wiccan, like Gardnerian, and say, well, our organization, our tradition is for exclusive people, and you have to go through certain things in order to get there? Or are you going to be more universal like other forms of Wicca? And every tradition, every spiritual tradition has both sides somewhere in their tradition. They have universalist and they have tribalist, and it's just the way it is. And if you look hard enough, if you really, really, really want to be involved in a certain organization or a certain path, then if you look hard enough, you're going to find a universalist branch that will accept you, regardless of where you're from, who you are, etc. But you will be advised, you will encounter organizations and traditions that are going to be more exclusive, based upon who you are, where you're from, and what your heritage is. So I think that I've covered most of the basic pagan definitions. I don't think that labels are deeply important. I think that people get too wrapped up in labels and they forget to live. They forget, well, I can't do that. That's too universalist. Or, oh, I can't do that. That's monotheistic. What is going on? There are so many variations, so many nuances. You might consider Catholicism to be polytheistic. Who knew? You might consider Wicca to be monotheistic in some fashions because of the understanding that all gods are emanations of one deity, respectively. So, there are so many variations, and all of the information that I've given has been very by the book, very, arbitrary. But you will realize that there are nuances and variations in every path. And it's just important to, get a basis of what these definitions are, to hopefully get you a good understanding and a good springboard for where to go from here. So I thank you for tuning in this week, and thanks for watching my videos. Until next time, signing off for now.